how's it going? We are now transitioning from the Enlightenment period to the period of Romanticism. It's important to realize that when we say romantic, it's not necessarily about love. The etymology of this term is rather complicated, actually. In the Middle Ages, a romance was a story, usually one that involved a knight having various types of adventures. The word romance in this sense actually means a story written in the vernacular, in other words, the language of the people, as opposed to a classical story written in Latin. After the Enlightenment, Romanticism was mainly a reaction against the Enlightenment, modernism, industrialism, that sort of thing. Deep feelings, which may be feelings of love, are also part of it. But they could also be deep feelings having to do with being in awe of the beauty of nature. There's this idea that we call the sublime. That was very important to the Romantics. The sublime has to do with the kind of beauty that can't be quantified using mere scientific thinking, right? So an Enlightenment thinker might have an approach to aesthetics that says we can have really specific categories and we can decide what is beautiful based on these categories, but a romantic would say, no, you can't define it that narrowly. There's this idea of something that you just can't explain. It's beautiful because you can't completely understand it. And that's something that the Romantics were interested in. This later sense of the term romantic also invokes the usage from the Middle Ages because there's a feeling that things were better in this past, a past that's largely mythological in some ways, a past that many people have made out to be better than it actually was. Sound familiar? This brings us to Faust. Written by the master poet Goethe, spelled weird but is pronounced Goethe. It's presented as a play, but it's really more of an epic poem, the way I think of it. As a play, it presents some problems for performance, although some people do perform it from time to time. Many people consider this the greatest work of German literature of all time. Goethe was like the German Shakespeare. So this is the edition that I've asked you guys to buy. It's translated by Walter Kaufmann. And one of the things that's interesting about it is that on the left-hand pages it has the original German, and on the right it has the English translation by Kaufmann. I do think it's interesting having the German available to you, even if you don't speak German or read German, or if you're like myself and maybe you picked up a few things over the years, but you are not proficient by any means. It's interesting to just see the original language and compare it to the translation, just to see what the German looked like. And Kaufmann has gone to great pains to mirror the form and rhyme schemes used by Goethe, sometimes at the expense of meaning, although most people who know about this sort of thing feel like Kaufmann did a pretty good job of the actual translating. I think there are a couple of places where Kaufmann gets a little bit clunky with rhymes in order to be true to Goethe's original form, but for the most part I find it very readable. One of the issues that we have with translating this is that Goethe did a lot of wordplay, and there are a lot of things that we as 21st century Americans who mostly don't speak German would not get. For example, Goethe mimics or imitates the style of some well-known German poets who his readers in his contemporary time would have been familiar with, but we might not. There are also some wordplay issues. He's often compared to the Irish writer James Joyce in the way that he plays with language. So if you're familiar with Joyce, then maybe you have some idea of what I'm talking about there. Because this is a very dense text, we're reading just a little bit more than half of the first part this week, and we'll discuss the rest of the first part next week. I've given you the page numbers in the discussion board. This is the quintessential story of someone making a deal with the devil. You may be familiar with other stories that use this trope, like the story of bluesman Robert Johnson, who went down to the crossroads to have the devil teach him how to play guitar, and then he became a famous bluesman, but he had to sell his soul in the process. This type of story is very old, goes back to biblical times, maybe further than that. Faust as a character existed before Goethe. There are other versions of the story that were, around for a couple of hundred years before Goethe adapts the story for his own purposes. But one popular version of this story was Dr. Faustus, written by the English playwright Christopher Marlowe in the time of Shakespeare. That existed before Goethe's Faust and was very popular. After the prelude, we find Faust in his study. He's this great scholar, right? He feels that he's learned everything that there is to know. What he lacks is experience. We find him lamenting his human limitations, and he almost kills himself. But then he hears the bells signifying the beginning of Easter, and so he stops himself. And on Easter Day, he takes a walk with his sidekick Wagner, spelled Wagner, pronounced Wagner. They're followed home by this strange poodle, this large dog. Follows them home. Once they get back to the apartment, transforms into Mephistopheles. In your translation, it's abbreviated to Mephisto. So Mephistopheles is one of the many names of the devil. Now what happens after that, I'll let you discover more on your own, and we'll talk about it this week on the discussion boards. Signing off for now, and I'll talk to you soon.